this is a horrific, horrific situation. What Israel has done now is just beyond, uh, it's just beyond anything. The fact that governments around the world aren't condemning this as the war crime it is as shocking as the event itself. Justin Trudeau, Canada's Prime Minister, said that it's unacceptable. Unacceptable? That's all he could say about it? This is a horrific, horrific war crime, killing 500 innocent men, women, and children in a hospital. This wasn't accidental. This wasn't so-called collateral damage. This was a targeted hit of the most vulnerable people in an enclave of extremely vulnerable people. These were the most extreme of them, those that are suffering from illness and injury, and they were just slaughtered by U.S. provided and U.S. supported Israeli bombs. This is it's unimaginable, and yet it has been done. The apartheid Zionist regime of Israel has once again shown that it has no regard for human life, for international law, for the basic human rights, no regard for humanity whatsoever. This is a shocking, shocking event, even for Israel.
And it's almost, the U.S. was just there the other day, Antony Blinken standing next to Netanyahu, proclaiming to give him unwavering support to the Israeli regime. Biden will supposedly, he canceled the trip now, on his way there tomorrow. So it's just wild that the Israeli regime has no qualms in hiding the fact that it is going after the civilian population, and the U.S. has basically given it this green light without speaking on the civilian casualties. Says that it's concerned. We've heard a couple. We haven't really even heard a lukewarm condemnation. Do you think? What do you think we're going to hear with respect to this attack on this hospital, if anything, from the states?
What the states will probably say is that this shouldn't have happened, and that Israel is investigating how it happened, and they trust Israel to find out what went wrong that caused this to happen. Now, if any other nation that isn't a close ally of the United States had done the same thing, the United States would be sanctioning them, threatening bombs, condemning them completely. But because it's Israel, it will be a very muted criticism, not even a condemnation, just a criticism, and saying that once again, Israel will do the investigation, and the United States will be interested in hearing the results of that investigation. Now, we know from past experience that when ever Israel commits a war crime that is recognized by much of the world, Israel then does its investigation, and it turns out that it determines that its soldiers were not in any way culpable, that they acted according to the needs of the situation, and that what they did was acceptable. Now, how they're going to manage this for the bombing of a hospital, killing at least 500 people, and I'm told estimates are much higher than that, and the United States will cover for them again. And the United States is showing its complete hypocrisy. The United States, which proclaims that it's a beacon of freedom and democracy, is very selective about who it provides freedom to, and it certainly doesn't to the Palestinians, who have been suffering for 75 years under Israeli occupation that's always been financed by the United States and supported in the United Nations by the United States. And we're seeing this continually, and I don't know when it's going to end.
And I mean, the Palestinians there in and around the hospital that survived this attack, or all the other attacks over the last 10 days on their homes and civilian infrastructure there, what do they, I mean, could you imagine their sense of loss and how they may feel that knowing the world knows this attack on this hospital took place, knowing the world knows that how many civilians perished tonight in this attack, but no one comes, no one shows up. Robert, what kind of helplessness does that elicit?
It must be very demoralizing. I'm in very sporadic contact with one or two people in Gaza, and they've told me about losses that they've witnessed, family members who've been killed by bombs. These are men, women, and children who have nothing to do with any kind of political organization. They are trying to live their lives as best they can under horrific conditions, and yet they're being victims of genocide, and the world is just watching and not doing anything about it. This has got to be so demoralizing. But the people of Palestine are so resilient, they're so strong, that we see again and again that they will not give up, they will not surrender. They are striving always to live their lives as best they can under horrific conditions. But the conditions currently in the Gaza Strip are far worse than anyone would have imagined they would have been a week or so ago.
And Russia put a proposal before the UN Security Council earlier, trying to get a humanitarian corridor open, try to get relief aid into, or get a couple of humanitarian corridors open for civilians to get out of Gaza, and to have humanitarian corridors open for humanitarian aid to get in. And it was basically shot down by, and not just by the U.S., but by a handful of countries at the Security Council. Why, Robert?
What they said was that because the resolution didn't specifically condemn Hamas, they weren't going to vote for it. Now, what difference does that make? These people are suffering horrifically. They need help. Get them the help. Keep the political concept out of it. We don't need to condemn Hamas or even Israel in order to open humanitarian corridors. Now, another issue, though, is that Egypt doesn't want Palestinian refugees coming into Egypt because the Egyptian government is afraid the United States or Israel will prevent them from returning to Palestine, the same way Israel has denied the right of return for 75 years for Palestinians who were driven out when the United Nations established Israel. But so that's an issue right there. But the fact that the United Nations Security Council could not say, yes, we need to provide humanitarian aid to these people who are running out of food. Drinkable water is very hard to come by in Gaza anyway. Water has to be boiled and treated before it can be drunk in most cases. And they don't have electricity. The fuel in hospitals and communities is running out. Many, it's already run out. These are people who don't have food, don't have water, don't have electricity. There's nothing political about that. Put that aside and get them the help they need. And yet the Security Council was unable to do that.
The Palestinian president says Israeli strike on the Gaza hospital is a hideous war massacre that cannot be tolerated. Saudi Arabia also strongly condemned, Robert, what it's called this heinous crime committed by Israeli forces by bombing the Al-Ali hospital in Gaza, leading to the deaths of hundreds. The kingdom's foreign ministry said in a statement on Tuesday. Just a couple weeks ago, if you remember, they had a delegation out there in the occupied West Bank, and they also had the tourism minister from Tel Aviv visiting the kingdom. What many people saw were initial steps toward normalization. They've put that on pause. Could you imagine if the kingdom would have gone through with that, what kind of blowback they'd get right now from their own people there, irate that they basically backed this regime just days before they killed so many Arabs in one fell swoop on this airstrike on this hospital, Robert?
They would be getting the kind of pushback that the countries that signed the so-called Abraham Accords are getting from their people. There have been massive demonstrations in those countries, and that's Saudi Arabia would be having that on steroids if that had happened recently. The people in the Middle East do not want normalization with Israel until a Palestinian state is established in freedom and peace, until the occupation ends. The government of Saudi Arabia knows that. The governments of these other countries know it, but they're being reminded of it by the mass rallies that are happening in their cities since this all began. Saudi Arabian government is absolutely right to cancel any thought of normalization with Israel. These government leaders are only looking for the profits that normalization would give them personally, not looking to benefit the people in their countries. But the people in countries do not want this. They want the Palestinians to be free. They want them to have a country. They want them to be free of occupation. Until that happens, Uh, Palestine was betrayed by several countries during the Trump administration when those countries signed the agreements and normalization agreements with Israel. Saudi Arabia hopefully will not make that mistake. But now at this point, with this, what has happened, this bombing of the hospital, this should be a turning point. But what's interesting is this is a horrific event that has happened. But Israel had told Palestinians in the northern part of the Gaza Strip to go to the south, take these routes to the south, and then bombed those routes. So where is the humanity? Where is the fairness? Even if one wants to say there are rules of war that need to be followed, and war is just barbaric anyway, but Israel is violating every rule of war that exists. These are crimes against humanity.
Right, and a lot of these people are displaced that were at this hospital, basically heeding that evacuation order from the north, and they came to seek refuge at this hospital, exactly what the Israeli regime bombed them into the afterlife. Can you believe that?
I can believe it because they've done it before. When it was 2014, I believe, when Israel was carpet bombing Gaza, and there was a UN refugee center clearly marked. There were many Palestinians there who were there for shelter, and Israel bombed it and killed dozens and dozens of people. And the United Nations objected and said this people, UN workers in Gaza at the time said this was clearly marked. There was no question that this was a UN refugee center. It should have been a safe place, just like that hospital should have been a safe place. But Israel knows it doesn't need to play by the rules because the United States will protect it.
And I mean, is there any recourse? I mean, we talked about this before, and so you get to a point where you're always basically on default back to resistance. That they've tried everything. The Palestinians in the international arenas, the courts, trying to help have international law go to bat for them, help them preserve their homeland, their identity, their rights, the right to self-determination, some dignity. And basically, when they exhaust all options and they end up in the state that they have been in for quite some time, they're left with nothing but resistance. And we've talked about that in the past, Robert. But when you see stuff like this, when you see them victimized by an atrocity such as we just saw, you think that something may change, something good may result from something this horrific. But you know what? I mean, I hate to be pessimistic, but it almost seems naive to think that this will actually touch the hearts and minds of people in power in the West to stop allowing this regime to do what it wants when it wants to these people.
Western governments have been very careful to demonize Muslims. And most Palestinians, not all certainly, there are Christians in Palestine, but a large majority are Muslims, and they've been demonized by the West. And this is why so many of these crimes are overlooked. I agree with you that one would think that bombing of hospitals, when does the world say this is enough? When does the world say this can't go on anymore? But that doesn't seem to happen with the way things currently stand. When the Hamas initiative happened on October 7th, many Palestinians or Palestinian sympathizers were asked to condemn this action. But you'll notice that Zionists are never asked to condemn what Israel does. That's always accepted. That's always because they're defending themselves. How the perpetrator can be seen as defending itself from the victim is completely illogical. I hope that people will finally say, this is enough. The slaughter of these innocent people has got to stop. But like you, I'm not optimistic because that should have happened during the March of Return when peaceful, unarmed Palestinians were demonstrating along the border, and they were shot. They were shot down and killed. They were blinded. They were maimed. This was a peaceful demonstration that went on for several weeks, for several months, but the world governments just turned a blind eye to it. So I don't know what it's going to take. Maybe the bombing of this hospital will do it. We'll have to see.
And Robert, Mahmoud Abbas, Palestinian president, is to hold an urgent meeting with Palestinian officials, saying that the bombing in this hospital is a war crime and a massacre. Why is it that many Palestinians feel that Abbas is more a part of the problem for Palestinians rather than a solution?
Well, I certainly agree with that. He is one of the tools that an occupied people have to make the occupation, to end the occupation, is by making it so difficult for the occupier to govern the territory. Because Abbas he has the so-called security coordination with Israel, he removes from the Palestinian people a very effective and nonviolent tool of resistance. And he has done nothing for the Palestinian people. Elections were scheduled a year or so ago. He canceled them. He said it was because he wasn't sure that Israel would allow Palestinians in Jerusalem to vote. So he therefore deprived millions of people from the right to vote. He also knew at that time that his popularity was under 20%. He would not have won the election. He would have been soundly and humiliatingly defeated, so he held on. But yes, he is definitely part of the problem, a major part of the problem. I don't know what's going to come out of this meeting that he's holding, because he is forever working to please Israel, so I can't imagine that it's going to be very effective.
Right, and you mentioned in your neck of the woods, Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau said that this hospital attack by the Israelis is horrific and absolutely unacceptable, and he made the remarks right in front of reporters after they brought up the fact that this just took place, and what the Canadian government's position is on it. He said that Canada has stressed Israel must abide by international law as it strikes back against Hamas for the attacks under Operation Al-Aqsa Flood back on the 7th of October. So when it says that Canada must abide by that the Israeli regime must abide by international law, what does that mean? Does that have any teeth? Will Canada stop sending anything to Israel if it doesn't? Will Canada push for any kind of resolution if it doesn't? Will Canada go beyond a simple condemnation if the Israeli regime refuses to heed the call?
No, it won't. Trudeau saying that Israel has to abide by the rules of war and so on, international law, is meaningless because, as you said, there's no teeth to it. He's not going to start sanctions. He's not going to do anything, even withdrawing the ambassador. There will be nothing. It's just empty words. And until the world community recognizes that genocide, that they can't sit back and watch genocide happen, then genocide is going to happen. And Canada is complicit in Israelis' crimes, the same as the United States is. The United States has a bigger hand in it because it finances it fully and protects it at the United Nations. But Canada is no better. Canada, of course, has an ugly history of colonialism itself, settler colonialism and genocide, and is just allowing another country to continue doing it.
Right, and Russia's Medvedev says Israel's deadly strike on this hospital in Gaza is a war crime. That's an assertion we have heard time and again from many world leaders throughout the evening and into the early morning hours here in West Asia. Robert, when you also, I should mention this, Robert, that we mentioned the Saudis, and now here is the UAE saying that this Israeli attack that's targeted the Al-Ahli hospital in the Gaza Strip has resulted in the death and injury of hundreds of people, and the United Arab Emirates has strongly condemned this attack. But here's the irony, and you very well know it's one of the handful of Muslim countries that normalized with the regime. How do you think that normalization is sitting with those regimes now, the Moroccans, the Sudanese, the Bahrainis, and the Emiratis, when they see stuff like this take place to their brethren in Gaza?
Well, the people of those countries have never liked normalization, and now there's going to be extreme rage because of it. Not only the bombing of the hospitals, possibly the last straw, that the killing of Palestinians in Gaza for this last week, the continued killing in the West Bank. Things are terrible there, not to the degree that they are in Gaza certainly, but people are dying there every day. Innocent Palestinians are dying there every day. The people in these other countries that have these other Middle East countries that have normalized relations with Israel are going to make their dissatisfaction, and that's a very, very mild word, make their anger known to the governments. These governments need to recognize that they need to sever those ties in order to keep peace in their own country and in order to satisfy the demands of justice and international law.
And for our viewers, these are live images out of Amman, Jordan. You can see, and Yemeni capital Sana'a, protests and protesters condemning Israeli and condemning the atrocities of this Israeli bombing of a hospital in the besieged Gaza Strip that has resulted in hundreds of deaths. We know that in the Jordanian capital Amman, on the left side of your screen there, they were encroaching upon the Israeli embassy, I believe, asking for everyone there to be expelled, but they're pushed back by security forces that fired tear gas to push them back. But you can see they have not dispersed. They are still on the scene in the early hours of the morning, very passionate about getting their point across, this condemnation, this outrage at the regime's relentless bombing over the last 10 days of civilians and civilian infrastructure in the besieged Gaza Strip, and particularly this bombing of a hospital where healthcare workers, the sick, families, thousands of people displaced there by the indiscriminate Israeli bombings of the besieged Gaza Strip have perished. At least 500, we believe, or more have died as a result of this attack on a hospital. This is not the only civilian infrastructure that has been targeted. Robert, the list goes on and on. Do we have Mr. Don DeBar too with us?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, let me put Robert Fantini up. Robert, if you could stand by and let me welcome Don to the program here. Don DeBar, welcome, activist and commentator, joining us from Ossining, New York. Don, this is beyond many of us, the Israelis, carrying out something this blatant. I mean, we thought leveling high-rise buildings and people's homes, UN shelters, schools and hospitals, but this is an unprecedented, this particular hospital with this many displaced people in it and sick, over 500, we know, in the five conflicts, the wars between Gaza and the regime in Tel Aviv. This has been an unprecedented catastrophe. We haven't seen nothing on this scale. Your initial thoughts?
Well, one of the things I've been trying to get people who are supporting Israel here in the United States to answer, because they think that the history of this conflict began on the 7th with the the attack by the Hamas military wing on the Israelis, to look back to their own history, particularly Jewish Europeans and Americans, to the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, and look at the rather extensive record, even at the Wiesenthal Center's website and at the various U.S. government archives, among other places, at the testimony of the people who participated. Number one, what drove them to do it? And number two, what did they do? And their situation was similar. They were walled in, 400,000 people. Okay, it's a fifth of what's walled in Gaza. walled in into a ghetto that was organized by the Nazis. That was by ethnicity, the same way the Palestinians are being treated in apartheid Israel and in their own remaining lands. The people that were in there were in this condition for life, and their lives were under constant threat. And that became intolerable for these Polish Jews, 400,000 of them, who rose up after a year and change of the Nazis coming in and grabbing them and taking people off the Treblinka where they were being killed, saying, we have nothing left to lose, we are going to fight. And maybe we can break this thing, but we're going to die on our feet. And their situation, the very worst that happened was the Germans came into Poland in 1939, and this is in 1943. Gaza has been under siege. I heard President Putin make reference to the siege of Leningrad that lasted 2.5, 3 years during World War II. Horrible as it was, hundreds of thousands of people died, horrible deaths. But that was for 2.5 years. Gaza has been in that state since 2007. I don't think people really have their mind wrapped around that. There are people who are 15 years old who were born in that siege in a prison camp with no hope and no path out of ever getting out. This produces anger. Some people don't take it. They stand up and they strike out. And unless you're going to solve this problem, world, you're going to deal with this repeatedly. And it only gets more vicious the more desperate people are. And I don't understand how a people loses the collective memory of exactly that condition less than 80 years after experiencing it.
Well, Don, they made movies about it, those pockets of Jews that formed those small resistance groups to try to fight back against the Nazis, and they portray them as heroes and freedom fighters, even if maybe some of them, their efforts didn't materialize into anything other than just getting slaughtered by the Nazis. They basically refer to them as martyrs and heroes, but the Palestinians are doing the same exact thing, repeating history and getting labeled as terrorists. How does that sit with you?
This is what human beings do when confronted with that situation. What it does, the irony of it, is that every time a group, whether it's the Nazis then or the Zionists now, when you do that to another person and you treat them as Untermenschen or as animals, as Netanyahu and his friends are calling the Palestinians, when you do that, you actually prove their humanity. Because they responded the only way human beings have ever responded to that. They rebel. They do not lay down for it. Slaves revolt. That's in our nature as human beings. There is a man who was a Polish union organizer, and he was a socialist politician, and he went into exile when the Nazis took over Poland. And he went back in, and he was in Warsaw Ghetto for a while, and then he left. He went to America, he went to the UK, he went to France, all the places that the Palestinians have gone seeking relief, and he got the same thing that the Palestinians are getting, nothing. And they watched as the Jews were slaughtered, and he went back to London, and he committed suicide. And he wrote a suicide note that essentially said, I cannot live with the shame of belonging to a species that would sit by and watch this done to one of their own. And we are now all this man whose name was Samuel Ziegelboim. We are all Samuel Ziegelboim right now. Someone has to step in and do something about this. And the situation, the configuration of forces, it's like the Armageddon waiting to happen. We understand that. The United States if they have 2,000 troops on the ground, 4,000 Marines ready to land, 2 carrier groups off the coast there. You have the Israelis bombing Syria, where the Russians have control of the air. You have Americans on the ground there, and they're basically daring to go into Gaza and slaughter 2 million people, or however many are left. knowing that Lebanon is not going to allow that, Hezbollah is not going to allow that, Iran's not going to allow that, the Saudis may not even allow that, because the people of Saudi Arabia, no matter what their government does, aren't going to stand by and watch it. And if they have to throw their government over to help the Palestinians, that'll happen fast.
And Don, let me put that to Robert Fantina too. Robert, I want to like you to weigh in on that. When Holocaust members or the Jews of the time, when they fought back against their oppression, against apartheid, when they fought against their ethnic cleansing and genocide, they're portrayed as heroes. But we see the West on a daily basis persevere to justify what is happening, what the Israeli regime is doing to Palestinians there in the besieged Gaza Strip and in the occupied West Bank and in occupied territories, and at the same time demonizing Palestinians when, according to Don, just a few decades ago, that was the hip thing to do, is to rebel and fight back that oppression and that apartheid, that genocide, that ethnic cleansing.
Yes, it's complete hypocrisy, because the people who resisted the Nazis were seen as heroes, or they're, at least they're today, they're seen as great heroes. And people should look at their example and see that what was happening then is exactly what is happening today. It is there are vulnerable people who are rising up and resisting the oppression of a more powerful nation. And that is a heroic thing to do under any circumstances. And that is what the people of Palestine have been doing for decades, and they are criticized for it constantly. When they are using violent means of resistance, which is acceptable under international law, just to mention that an occupied people has the right to resist the occupation in any way at their disposal, including armed rebellion. When they do that, they're criticized. When they do something peaceful, like the March of Return, the Great March of Return, or the BDS movement, for example, those are condemned and criticized. So they can do nothing right in the eyes of many of the Western governments, the United States especially, because whatever they do, whether it's peaceful resistance or non-peaceful resistance, they're going to be criticized. The U.S. and Israel want them to just roll over and die, and if they won't, they will kill them. So, and that's what we're seeing happening now. There is no sense of fairness or justice in this, no matter how you look at it. It can't be rationalized away in any way, shape, or form. It is what Israel is doing is repeated war crimes, continual war crimes, and crimes against humanity against the people of Palestine.
Mr. Don DeBar, let me just first catch our viewers up to speed. These are live images from Amman and Sana'a, Yemen, Amman, Jordan. Earlier, we had images out of Tehran, Baghdad, Istanbul, Beirut. These are protesters out in the early morning hours condemning Israeli bombing of a hospital in the besieged Gaza Strip that has resulted in possibly over 500 civilian casualties, including healthcare workers. That includes doctors and nurses. Many Palestinians displaced by indiscriminate bombing on civilian targets throughout other parts of Gaza that were sheltering at that hospital, as well as the sick and the relatives at that hospital. Joining us are Robert Fantina out of Canada and Don DeBar joining us from the states, upper northeast New York. Mr. DeBar, after this attack, we know a lot of attitudes really should change in the West, really have to change in the West with respect to this regime, but do they, in your perspective, and why or why not?
Well, the short answer, why not, is impunity. We saw an example of this at the United Nations Security Council yesterday. Russia introduced a resolution to the Security Council, which, by the way, is the legal avenue for addressing the issues that are on the table between Hamas, the Palestinians generally, Israel, and whatever legal construct they might bring to the table also, and the United States and all the other parties. The Security Council under the UN Charter, which was adopted among other places by the United States and other, almost every nation on the planet, That is the primary international law with respect to disputes. The Security Council has jurisdiction over the use of military force, and absent and there are treaties, Geneva and others that deal with how to conduct a war, who you can conduct war with and against, and under what conditions, and all of that. Completely blown out of the water. The entire thing is a per se violation of international law, of the UN Charter, and so Russia brings a resolution, in essence, that calls for a ceasefire. No finger pointing, no negotiation points, stop shooting, stop killing, let's sit down and talk. The United States would not endorse that. They said that unless it condemns Hamas, and they started adding conditions to it, they refused to endorse it. In other words, they want the killing to go on. They instructed their own diplomatic corps not to discuss with anyone, including their own staffs, anything relating to de-escalation, deconfliction, peace talks, or whatever. This is to go on unimpeded and with the protection of the United States veto at the United Nations Security Council. So the short answer, again, was impunity. Israel can do what it wants because the United States is allowing it to do what it wants, and the international institutions that are supposed to protect the people from wild actors like the Zionist state is doing in terms of mass murder of civilians, they are helpless to stop it because of the way the operation of the Security Council works. The only thing that's going to stop this is if the state of Israel and or the United States is looking at it costing them more than it's worth. To Israel, this is their opportunity. They have wanted, if you talk to a right-wing figure is now the left part of the ruling coalition. The people that help keep him in power, which by the way means help keep him out of prison, because the minute he's not prime minister, he's going to jail for probably the rest of his life. That party, they openly claim that God gave them the land, all of that land, and then some, and they want it back, and they're in power to acquire it. So, you know, when God gives you land and somebody else is living on it, you pretty much have the right to do whatever you need to get them out of the way. And that's the way they see it. And that's the policy that's being pursued, and the United States is enabling it. With my money, by the way, and the money of every other taxpayer in the United States.
Yeah, that's a good point. And yet the people have no say on it and haven't for years, that $4 billion, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. There's a lot of other, possibly up to in excess of 7 or 8 billion, possibly even 10, that reaches the regime every year from the states.
Biden is asking for $100 billion today for Israel and Ukraine. $100 billion. That's more than the annual budget for housing and urban development. In other words, all of the housing assistance for the 330 million people in this country don't get as much money as he wants to give to Ukraine and Israel for the next term, for like the next year.
Robert Fantina, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Volker Turk, said that words fail me. Tonight, hundreds of people were killed horrifically in a mass strike at Al-Ahli Arab Hospital in Gaza City, including patients, healthcare workers, and families that have been seeking refuge in and around this hospital. Once again, the most vulnerable. This is totally unacceptable. And then at least 6 people were also killed this afternoon when an UNRWA school was hit in the Al-Maghazi refugee camp. The school had been serving as a shelter, he said, for some 4,000 people seeking refuge. Hospitals are off limits and sacrosanct, and they must be protected at all costs. We do not yet know the full scale of this carnage, but what is clear is that the violence and killing must stop at once. All states with influence must do everything in their power to bring an end to this horrendous situation, that civilians must be protected and humanitarian aid must be allowed in to reach those in need as a matter of urgency. Those found responsible must be held to account. You know, Robert, what kind of rhetoric, and I'm sorry I read that whole thing out, and I appreciate both gentlemen's patience on this, but I read that out because this is the same exact verbatim kind of language we heard when we were when Volker Turk was addressing ISIS, which is Daesh, atrocities just a couple years ago when they were cutting people's heads off and taking civilian populations and terrorizing the heck out of them. This is the same exact call to condemnation we were hearing from the UN Human Rights Chief.
Yes, we're hearing it from them, and that is showing that the Israeli regime is as savage as any other terrorist organization, or more so because they have much more power to do it. But the question again is, what is the United Nations going to do about it? What are they going to do other than issuing a strongly worded statement? That is meaningless. And as the vote in the Security Council the other day or yesterday indicates, the members of the Security Council cannot agree on how to help vulnerable people. And we mentioned this before, there's no place for politics, just get them food and water and shelter. But issuing statements doesn't do it. And this isn't helpful. Calling on all governments that have any influence, well, the only governments that have any influence with the United States, really, the only with Israel is the United States. The United States isn't going to change. The United States relies on Israel, and United States members of Congress rely on Israeli lobbies to get them reelected. They're not going to give up their jobs for something as trivial as international law and human rights. No, they're going to continue to endorse genocide so that they can get the donations from the pro-Israeli lobbies. This just shows the level of morality or lack thereof that so many government representatives in the United States and elsewhere have. They will not recognize genocide when it is right in front of them.
Gentlemen, I want to thank you both for joining us. I appreciate both of you putting your time